So I've recently joined WHO from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I work in the NTD department there. The thing that I thought I might be able to do today is talk a little bit about the intersection between the NTDs and WASH. And I think many people in the room are quite familiar with NTDs and will appreciate already the importance that implementation of WASH interventions has on control, elimination and eradication of various NTDs. I'll cover that in brief in the next few slides, but I think it's also important to consider what the importance of NTDs might be to the WASH community, and so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But fundamentally, I think the thing that NTDs can bring to WASH is, rather than just talking about equity in access to water and sanitation, or diarrheal disease, or economic impact of WASH interventions, showing things like, or talking about the fact that individuals who don't have access to good water and sanitation might end up with a 30-foot or 30-centimetre worm emerging from their leg or body is a very powerful tool for advocacy and for trying to get increased access to water and sanitation. So the NTDs, as many of you know, are a group of 17 viral, bacterial, protozoal and helminth infections that affect about 1.4 billion people. And those people tend to be the poorest of the poor in the least developed countries. The diseases that particularly have relevance to the question of water and sanitation are the ones that are highlighted in red there, and I'll talk briefly about each of those in a couple of slides. On the WASH side, I'm much less familiar with how things work, but the particular things that the WASH community within WHO are working on from a monitoring point of view are two things called GLAAS, which is the Global Assessment and Analysis of Water and Sanitation. It's one of these dreadful UN acronyms, and the Joint Monitoring Program on Water and Sanitation, which again is an interagency effort between UNICEF, WHO. So briefly, Professor Pedrosa is going to talk in more detail about this soon, but the picture here is of a typical Buruli ulcer transmission area in Benin, and it's clearly an unimproved water source, and we think that its exposure to mycobacteria in the water that may be of relevance there. Yael Velleman will talk a little bit about trachoma later on, but trachoma is a bacterial infection that's spread from eye to eye, and which becomes much less common when people have the ability to wash their faces and keep them clean every day. Schistosomiasis is an infection caused by Taenia solium, which normally maintains a cycle in man and pigs, where pigs ingest human feces that contain Taenia solium proglottids, or eggs. But in the circumstance in which human feces contaminates human food, those eggs can establish the normal pig part of the cycle in the human and cause cysticercosis. And when the cysts arise in the brain, neurocysticercosis is the result, which is a very common cause of epilepsy, particularly in Southeast Asia. Dracunculiasis, guinea worm disease, I've already mentioned, hopefully on the way out, but of the 130 villages that reported cases in 2013, 72 or 70% of them had no improved water sources at all, and that's clearly a very important factor in sustaining this disease. Eradication of guinea worm can be undertaken at a number of levels, all of which are very important to the particular water sources where transmission occurs. The foodborne trematodiases are hopefully going to be the subject of increasing attention from the NTD department WHO over the next few years. This is a life cycle of the Chinese liver fluke, Clonorchis sinensis, and this transmission of this could be entirely interrupted by preventing human feces that's contaminated with Clonorchis eggs getting into water where the snail intermediate host resides. Similarly, schistosomiasis would be broken as a transmission cycle if human urine and feces did not enter water where the intermediate hosts live. And the soil-transmitted helminths, which many of you are familiar with, are a number of infections, all of which are a problem because human feces contaminates the environment and is then either eaten or exposed to human skin where the hookworms enter to complete the life cycle. All right, so our thesis in the NTD department as far as WASH goes really is that increased investment in WASH interventions will improve access to water and sanitation, which should reduce the incidence and prevalence of diarrhea and NTDs, decrease morbidity and mortality, which should increase economic productivity and allow increased investment in WASH overall. So the virtuous cycle is something that we all like to believe in. People talk about $1 being invested in water and sanitation returning $5 in increased economic productivity. I'm not necessarily sure that the evidence base to support all the links in this cycle is solid, but that's certainly the basis on which we operate. Trachoma is the field of which I know best, and it's one of the few diseases for which randomized controlled trials of WASH interventions have been shown to be effective, and I think Yale might talk about that later. Although the evidence base is perhaps a little bit sketchy for most of these things, we all believe that these interventions are worth undertaking. All right, so then to look at the other side, the WASH side, the two things I particularly wanted to highlight are this GLAAS and the JMP. And those two things are elements that are taken from a very broad range of monitoring tools, most of which have acronyms that I don't understand and perhaps hope never to understand. But there's quite a lot going on in the WASH sector, and many of you in this room know more about them than I do. So the first thing is just to talk a little bit about GLAAS, the Global Analysis and Assessment of Sanitation and Drinking Water, which is a report that's produced by WHO on behalf of UN Water every 2 years. It started in 2010, and it monitors global inputs and self-assessed national capacities to deliver sanitation and drinking water services, with the major objective to identify drivers and bottlenecks to progress towards MDG and national targets, and to serve as a repository of global data to aid decision-making. And it considers both donor and country strategies and actions on WASH. So it's looking at the inputs to the process rather than the outcomes, which is the province of the JMP. In the most recent GLAAS work, which is being completed this year, 90 countries participated and 20 external support agencies, 8 agencies, contributed data. So the countries, or the countries shown in green there, are countries that are providing bilateral aid, such as DFID in the UK, USAID, AusAid, Japan, and there are a number of other agencies that are highlighted with bullets and leaders there, and then the countries in orange are aid recipient countries that participated in the process. Now, as many of you know, Millennium Development Goal 7 is to ensure environmental sustainability, and Target 7C, which is the most relevant to us here, is to halve by 2015 the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water and basic sanitation. The word sustainable is used in there, but in fact the indicator to look at MDG 7 is the proportion of the population that uses an improved drinking water source or an improved sanitation facility. And the sustainability part of that question is not really addressed in any way. The means that we use to assess those indicators is the JMP, which monitors country, regional, and global progress since 1990. And it's apparent that quite a lot of progress has been made on the water side, and in fact the MDG target for water was probably attained in 2010. On the sanitation side, there's been some progress, but not quite as much, and certainly we're not there as far as the MDG goal goes. And this shows progress for urban on your left and rural populations on your right in access to improved sanitation facilities, with the bars in red there on each side showing the proportion of the population that still engages in open defecation. So some progress, we're not quite there yet. Though there has been improvement, the thing that lies behind the numbers that we don't talk about quite so much is the fact that there's quite a lot of underlying inequality and inequity. So although the world mean for access to improved sanitation is 64%, in Southeast Asia, to choose an example, it's 55%, which is split between 71% of people in urban areas having access to improved sanitation and only 43% in rural areas. The best country in the region had 99% access, the lowest 19%, and Indonesia, again to pick an example, had 59% access with a quite marked urban-rural split. And if you looked at the richest quintile in urban and rural areas, each had a relatively high access to improved sanitation, but the poorest quintile, there's a very marked disparity between urban and rural areas. So it's still very much the rural poor who are getting the worst end of the deal. As one would expect, rich people have greater access than poor people, but one of the things that is apparent when you look at time trends is that the improvements that have been seen between the early 1990s and today have predominantly been in the richest populations, richest segment of the population. So the increase in sanitation has been achieved by rich people getting better facilities. So on the right of the screen there, you can see the richest quintile in Indonesia has had an increase in its access to improved sanitation from 51% in 1990 to 78%. The second highest quintile in wealth terms, an increase from 26% to 53%. So they have doubled their access to improved sanitation, but the poorest quintile haven't really moved very much at all. And in fact, the rich-poor gap has increased from 44% in 1995 to 67% in 2010. Similarly, and perhaps for exactly the same reason, there's quite marked disparities in access when you look at people's level of education. And just to pick out one figure from this, in India, 70% of people who have had no education at all or only preschool education practice open defecation. 15% of university-educated people practice open defecation. Now that figure in itself I think is quite striking. It means quite a lot of people in a country as populous as India with relatively high university attendance. But still you can see the disparity between people who are educated and those who are not. Similarly, if you look across different ethnicities, there's quite marked disparities between different ethnic groups in access to water and sanitation. All right, so one of the things that I'm told the WASH community is going to focus on post-2015 when new indicators to replace, or new targets to replace the Millennium Development Goals are being developed, to look at the disparities between rich and poor, urban and rural, and so on. Because the focus on average attainment that the Millennium Development Goals has had has been silent on issues of discrimination, inequality, and disparity. And the targets that are developed really need to ensure that the most disadvantaged, the most marginalised and discriminated against are reached with the interventions that we're able to provide. The WASH community are talking about equality checklists and wealth quintile analysis and so on. And I guess one of the things that at the NTD department at WHO we are trying to encourage is the thought that because NTDs are things that affect the poorest of the poor, that could be a very good marker for people's access to water and sanitation, and maybe in fact the best thing to look at. If we can show that we're getting rid of NTDs, it's very likely that that's going to be through sustained improvements in water and sanitation in the poorest people of the poorest areas in the poorest countries. That's my email address. Thank you very much for listening. I'd be happy to take questions now or in the panel discussion later.